Well, welcome back. We're looking at original sin today. Let's dive right in with this Q&A from the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Did all mankind fall in Adam's first transgression? And the Catechism answers us, the covenant being made with Adam, not only for himself, but for his posterity, his children, his offspring. And then it says, we sinned in him and fell with him in his first transgression. Again, this gets back to an idea that we've already talked about, that Adam is a representative person. He represented all of us. And so Watson says in this chapter, he says, while he, that is Adam, while he stood, we stood. When he fell, we fell, right? And Watson, he wants to, throughout this chapter, he keeps referencing back to Augustine and Pelagius. And Augustine and Pelagius in the 4th century, I believe it was, the 4th century, they were debating this topic quite a bit there, and they debated issues of sin and issues of grace and salvation. And their debates on sin have really been some of the most important conversations on this matter that have, in many ways, formed the different positions on this issue of sin, of man's nature, and these sorts of matters. And so Watson is firmly planting himself in the Augustinian camp as opposed to Pelagius's camp, which Pelagius, you have to remember, was officially declared to be a heretic, which is why people who will take his positions have tended to not take his positions fully, but have been called semi-Pelagian, right? So they're not quite heretics, but they're taking that view. And this is very important for Watson to take the Augustinian perspective, because from his view, much of the medieval church, much of what we would call today Roman Catholicism, that stream of the Christian church, by his time had started to really fall into more of a semi-Pelagian position. But Watson, he quotes Augustine to say, hey, Augustine's with me on this issue, where Augustine said, all of us sinned in Adam because we were part of him. Well, then we want to look at the question, and it's such an important question that a lot of people today still have, which is, well, how is it that Adam's sin is our problem? Okay, I get it. He's a representative, but how is it that I'm a sinner? How is it that his sin so long ago actually impact my nature, right? And my position before God? How's there a connection when there's such a distance between us? And Watson says the key word here is imputation. Imputation. And he says this, not only is the guilt of Adam's sin imputed to us, okay, so his guilt is accounted to us, right? His debt is made our debt, okay? So not only is his guilt imputed to us, but the depravity and corruption of his nature is transmitted to us as poison is carried from the fountain to the cistern. That is, this is that which we call original sin. So Watson here doesn't get into the details too much, and so I won't either. But just to say this, that there's sometimes a debate that goes on between, is the reason that I'm a sinful person because I am physically of the offspring of Adam, or is it more so because I'm covenantally connected to Adam? And I think that Watson is really laying out a position that emphasizes imputation, the covenantal connection, but that does not in any way discount, but actually leaves a position for this idea of the transmission of sin, as he says, poison carried from a fountain to the cistern. So I think both of these things have to be brought in, that we're covenantally connected to Adam, and therefore our positioning before God is that of a guilty sinner, right? But also this corruption, right? Our sinful nature is because we're part of humanity. We're part of the physical offspring of Adam, and the virgin birth, right? Well, Romans 5, which speaks to this, and I could just quote Romans 5:19, for as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. While Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 15, will emphasize this covenantal connection to Adam, right? His guilt is our guilt. The virgin birth, I think, is saying to us, here's a miracle that's meant to speak to the fact that while, yes, Adam is truly a human being, he is the root, right? The foundation of a new humanity. That he's a second Adam. He's a representative person in his own right, in the way that nobody else in all of history has been except for Adam. Right? So the virgin birth is pointing to that unique nature of Christ, but Christ is still nonetheless part of humanity. Right? He's still part of humanity, which is why he can enter into our position and take our guilt upon him, and so on and so forth. But he's the root of a new humanity. There's a break between him and Adam, and so he's not, in that way, he doesn't have a sinful fallen nature in the way that we do. So we want to say both, I think, that there's a transmission of the corrupted nature by the fact that we are physically connected to Adam as his offspring, and there's also a covenantal connection as well, which is why we are considered guilty before God in that way, not just because we sin every day, our actual sins, but because we are also connected to the original sin of Adam, that in that first man's sin, in the sin of one man, we were made sinners, as Romans 5 says. Well, again here we see that Watson wants to distinguish his position of how we are connected to Adam, of Adam's relationship to him, a relationship to us by covenant and by transmission or physical offspring. He wants to say that's different than the Pelagian view. The Pelagian position says, you know what? Adam's sin is only harmful to us in that it's a very bad example that a lot of human beings imitate, right? We imitate it. We replicate the rebelliousness of Adam. It's a bad example to us, but Pelagius wants to deny that there's any sort of corruption of our nature that has taken place because Adam's original sin, that there's any kind of covenantal connection that makes us guilty. He wants to say that we are not corrupted in the way that Augustine and that Watson would want to say. So going a little bit deeper on what is original sin, Watson says negatively, we have lost our original purity, right, that man once had before Adam's sin. And positively, not that this is good, but in the sense of addition, whereas negatively, as we lost something, this is we gained something. What did we gain? Well, positively, we gained, not so good, we gained a contaminated and defiled nature, right? Original sin has, Watson says, turned beauty into leprosy. It has turned the azure brightness, I probably mispronounced that, but the brightness of our souls into midnight darkness. And then just going a little bit more on that contamination, Watson says that we have now an aversion from good, right? A disgust of holiness, he says, and we have a propensity to evil. And again, Watson goes after the Pelagians. If there is so much goodness in us since the fall, why is there not as much natural proneness to good as there is to evil. Right? If we really are so good, our nature is neutral, or it leans in the way of goodness and purity, as the Pelagians would say, then why is it that, if you're thinking of a scale here, right? And this sort of goes in the way of goodness and this in the way of evil. Watson says, why is it that for every single human without exception, the scale always is like this, right? We're always more prone to evil. You don't have to teach a child to sin, right? In the same way that you teach them manners, that you teach them goodness. And then there's this section, and I won't go through all of it. I'm just going to just run through it, but I'm not going to talk much about it. But it's a section that's really worth your time, where Watson goes much deeper into the nature of original sin, and he goes through 8 different points on this. He talks about the universality of original sin, the adhesion of it. It sticks to us, it stains us. He talks about how it twists and hinders the exercise of God's worship. All right, so it sort of sucks our desire for worship. It sucks that out of us, and it twists the way that we worship. He talks about how often our original sin it's always there, but it's sometimes under the surface of our sort of civil goodness. He says, but it often breaks forth unexpectedly. Number 5, he says that original sin mixes and incorporates itself into all of our duties, all of our graces. And number 6, it's a vigorous, active principle within us. This is a really important thing for us to understand. Number 7, it causes all actual sin. And number 8, it is not perfectly cured in this life, right? In the sense that we don't have all of our sin completely done away with in this life, even for Christians. And man, this section, if any of that piques your interest, just please go read some of that. Spend some time with Watson. But lastly, let's just wrap things up with 4 points about the uses of this doctrine of original sin. Number 1, it confutes the libertines and Quakers who say they're without sin. So some of the Anabaptist traditions, some of the Methodist and Wesleyan traditions, they've taught that when you become a Christian, you can get to the point where you will have no more sin whatsoever. It's called perfectionism. And the Reformed tradition has always rebuked perfectionism and said, no, that's not true. And the doctrine of original sin actually does refute that. And it shows it just very clearly. Number 2, the doctrine of original sin, the reality of our original sin, it deeply humbles us. And so Watson says, some think as long as they are civil, they are well enough. But he says, a river may have fair streams, but vermin at the bottom. Then he says, thou carriest a hell about thee. Oh, how should original sin humble us. Number 3, look up daily to God for help. Beg Christ's blood to wash away the guilt of sin and his Spirit to mortify the power of it. And then 4th and finally, Watson says, let original sin make us walk with continual jealousy and watchfulness over our hearts. The sin of our nature is like a sleeping lion. The least thing that awakens it makes it rage. A wandering heart needs a watchful eye. I love the end of that. Where, our sinful nature is like a sleeping lion, and just a little bit, just takes a little nudge, and it awakens in rage. And I think all of us, especially every Christian who's aware of their sinfulness, all of us hear that and we think, yeah, that's about right. That's about right. That's a good descriptor. And then the imperative at the end there, a wandering heart necessitates a watchful eye. And so, Christian, we all have original sin. We all have, in that sense, a heart that is prone to wander, right? As one hymn puts it, we're prone to wander. We have wandering hearts. So we need to be watchful. We need to use the wisdom of Scripture. We need to cry out in prayer for God's help, for the Spirit to to mortify our sinful flesh. We need to be fighting daily against sin. So there it is. There's original sin. Next time we'll look at, I believe it's misery, which will wrap up this section. And then we'll get to move on after next week. We'll get to move on to, I believe it's moving on to the covenant of grace. So that's where we'll be then, but that's it for now, and we will see you next time.